question, having dealt so comprehensively with the situation in Europe with such insight, if I might ask your opinion on the current situation in the United States and the likely effect on the security of American Jews, of Israeli Jews, with 2 more years of this particular administration left.
So the likely effect on American Jews, you say?
American and Israeli Jews.
Okay. Well, the likely effect on American Jews of 2 more years of President Obama is 2 more years of denying to themselves what they've done, as far as American Jews are concerned. Which sounds a bit unkind, but I'm afraid it's largely true. You know, American Jews overwhelmingly voted for President Obama. I think President Obama is a terrible danger to the whole of the Western world. Six years ago, I couldn't believe that America was going to do what it probably did, what it did and elect him. Because it always seemed to me that he had a very, very clear agenda, which he's carried out to the letter. His agenda was to increase the power of the state at home and to diminish the power of America abroad. And he's made it very clear why he's doing the latter, because he thinks that, he seems to think that one of the main reasons why the Arab and Muslim world is so upset and so angry and is attacking the West is because of the historic wrongs that the West, particularly America, has done to that world. And therefore you can make the world safe by extending the hand of friendship to these people, and by showing them that America is no longer going to do that. It's no longer going to uphold any of its own values, and the world is going to retreat, it's going to leave the world alone, and instead it's going to extend the hand of friendship to all these people that have suffered so grievously, and America sounds like the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it's going to say, come in from the cold, we respect you, and we're all going to work together. And then the Islamic Republic of Iran and others will say, oh, you know what, these Americans, we used to say they're the great Satan. Actually, they're just really a pussycat, really, and we're going to have a nice time. It's completely mad, and what Obama has done, he's empowered Iran in the region, and we can see the most extraordinary realignment of countries going on because of the fear of Iranian power, which Obama has allowed to happen. And he's created a vacuum in the world, whereas America once was, the country in which people looked to safeguard freedom and democracy around the world. He's taken America out of that role, and he's created a vacuum. And it's not surprising that into that vacuum have come Vladimir Putin and the Chinese, who are basically saying, well, we now have an opportunity to resurrect the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire. So they're moving into country after country, or trying to move into country after country. The Chinese are having great success in doing this in Africa and the Middle East. They're moving in. They're expanding their spheres of influence, because they can see the West has retreated. So the world is up for grabs. That's what Obama has done.
Muslims have very, very high unemployment. Hindus, on the other hand, do not. The situation is fairly similar in France, and I speculate it's probably similar in Australia. I'm also conscious that a lot of the Muslims who go across country, wealthy families, go to ISIS, but query whether the economic aspects of the way Muslims seem to be, how is that relevant to the situation you described?
Okay, the question, the gentleman suggests that Muslims in Britain are less likely to be employed, and wonders whether that situation has anything to do with the fact that they are increasingly, they become radical. And the answer is no, it doesn't have anything to do with it in my view, at all. They may have a higher level of unemployment. I'm not quite sure what the figures are, quite honestly. I can't really give you an answer to that. But the fact is that we can see from the people who have been arrested and tried for terrorist offences, we can see the kind of people who are joining up to these, to not just to ISIS, but to Islamist extremist organisations. A lot of them are very highly educated. They come from perfectly solid homes with jobs. They don't come from, impoverished families necessarily at all. The most highly educated people have been involved in these terrible acts, and across the world you can see, for some reason, there seems to be a rather high concentration of doctors and paediatricians among them, people who are doing the beheading. Okay? So this thing does not correlate with poverty or deprivation or lack of education. It correlates with something else, which is religious fanaticism.
Okay, speak up.
What is the capacity of the State of Israel to accept large-scale immigration? There is insufficient housing, insufficient jobs in Israel, and if we look at the French migration to Israel, the wealthy have already bought their flats in Israel a long time ago, but there is a substantial percentage of component of poor people who cannot transfer and end up anywhere except in a tent. Does Israel have that additional capacity?
The question is, does Israel have the additional capacity to take all the Jews who are coming to Israel? The French already have their apartments, and there were people living in tents. I don't know the answer to that question, but it seems to me that Israel is infinitely elastic, in that Israel has taken, in recent memory, huge numbers very quickly from Russia, from Soviet Union, from Africa. Now, did those very large-scale immigrations cause social problems? Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. And did Israel manage those social problems well? No, in many respects. And they could have done better? Of course. But what's the point? Jews will come in from everywhere. That is Israel's core mission, from everywhere. And it will find ways of accommodating them. And it may well be that it's difficult. I think the history of immigrants the history of immigration into Israel has, over the decades of Israel's existence, has often been extremely difficult. People lived in extremely difficult circumstances. Is it ideal? No. Will Israel be forced to say, we can't take any more Jews? I think that's almost inconceivable.
Well, that's something I think along the UIA. Israel took in over 1 million. Israel took in over 1 million Jews from the Soviet Union in a very short period of time. But the reality is they became the locomotive for economic growth in Israel and a part of the miracle of modern Israel. And the French coming to Israel will be exactly the same. They'll integrate into society and they'll bring a vibrancy and additional strength and economic powerhouse to make it happen. And that's part of the miracle of modern Israel. And all of us here can make a difference by donating more to the UIA.
I'll speak up. Yes, no, we need
Excuse me.
You did mention that by and large the governments of Europe, etc., are on side. Yet, as far as Israel is concerned, to some extent, and certainly as far as anti-Semitism is concerned, they mouth maybe the right things. How do you explain the voting where only Australia, with the current Prime Minister, and Canada, and America, despite Obama, vote one way and the rest of the world votes the other way? And United Nations isn't all that important, but it has an influence on the rest of the world.
Well, if I've given you the impression that the governments of Europe are pro-Israel, entirely apologise. That was entirely. I must have had a sort of mental lapse at that point. My point is that when it comes to anti-Jew, they are programmed. You cannot be anti-Jew. They know that. And therefore, these recent atrocities against Jews as Jews have made them horrified because it's in Europe. But when it comes to Israel, it's a completely different matter. Now, it's a complicated business, the attitude of European governments to Israel. It's very complicated. It's more complicated than it appears on the surface. On the one hand, you have the screaming and the shouting by the intelligentsia, which goes on the whole time, amplified by the media, which creates the impression that these countries are ferociously hostile to Israel. Now, the intelligentsia is ferociously hostile to Israel in all the ways that we know. It's malevolent, it's deranged, that's all true. When it comes to governments, it's more complicated. Take Britain, and I can't really speak for European governments, but they're kind of similar, but different. In Britain, you have several strands working virtually independently of each other. You have the military and intelligence strand, which depends very heavily on its relations with Israel. Its ties could not be stronger, because that's what they're all involved in the same fight, and they know it. The military know it. The intelligence service knows it. You know, what Israel provides to Britain in terms of intelligence is invaluable, and what Israel provides to Britain in terms of military hardware is also invaluable because of the Israeli genius of making stuff like drones, except that the British go to the most dramatic lengths to conceal the fact they're getting this stuff from Israel, and heaven forbid a screw or a widget in a drone is manufactured 5 centimetres over the green line. And then it can't happen. The whole order goes down the drain. So that's curious in itself. So the military and intelligence, at military intelligence level, the ties are very, very great. At the trade level, the ties are very great as well. Forget all the stuff about boycotts, all that noise and fury. The trade level, the trade links are very important to Europe because of the Israeli genius, what Israel is producing. They can't do without it. They can't do without Israeli products. So at those levels, these ties are enormous. I mean, they're so strong. At the political level, it's a very different matter. At the political level, you have politicians who distance themselves from Israel, who won't defend it properly. When Israel goes to war to defend its citizens from being murdered, it says, we support you for 5 seconds, but basically we're not going to allow you to do what you need to do. Now, why do they say that? Mainly in the case of Britain, because of the historic view that Britain's sort of geopolitical interests lie so heavily with the Arab world, and its trade ties are terribly important. I mean, Qatar, you know, $20 billion pounds so far of investment. It's in Britain. They can't. And of course, the oil thing is absolutely crucial. So it's working on different levels, and also the British government, whether it's Conservative or Labour, or in your terms Liberal or Labour, it's very concerned about the whole cultural attitude towards Israel. You know, it would take great courage to stand up as your Prime Minister stands up and says, you know, we support Israel unequivocally. It's almost inconceivable for a British politician to do that because of the general culture of dislike and distrust and so on. So it's actually quite a complicated business, but there is an absolute distinction that has been drawn between attitudes to Israel on the one hand and attitudes to Jews on the other. In my view, the only healthy situation is for them to join up the dots and put them together.
Melanie, I understood your summation of the situation in Europe to be that either Europe will go over the edge and submit to Islam, or they'll stand up and fight. In either case, it seems to me that the Jews are doomed, in either of those scenarios. Yet you are very ambivalent about saying that the Jews should really get out of Europe now.
Well, I am ambivalent because you have to really have a sort of crystal ball to say, you know, that's it, it's over. I mean, I don't really know what's going to happen. It seems to me that either way is very difficult. I mean, you know, if Britain became an Islamic country, the situation of Jews would be, I think, pretty impossible. If Britain fights, or if its people fight, who knows what's going to happen? I fear there will be violence on the streets, and I fear the Jews will get it in the neck. But I don't know that. And it would be, I think, very foolish, very unwise for anyone to stand up and say, well, it's quite obvious that either way, you know, it's all over. I may be being, you know, too pusillanimous and too Pollyanna-ish. Not something that's often thrown at my feet, but anyway. Because, you know, you have Netanyahu saying, you know, what are you waiting for? Come. And everybody going, oh, don't think you should have said that. But anyway, you can understand why he's saying it. Because it does look pretty bleak. It does look pretty bleak. But I mean, this sounds awful, but I really don't underestimate the ties people have to the country where they have lived for decades, and where they... What?
Like in 1933.
It's not like 1933. I actually find that quite... No, it's not like 1933, because as I've said earlier, you do not have the institutions of the state behind this. You have the institutions of the state who really genuinely want to stop it, but they're not doing a very good job of it. It's not 1933. I mean, I think it sort of does a terrible disservice to the memory of people who made the decisions in 1933, or who made the wrong decisions, say this is all the same thing. It's not the same thing. It's bad, it's very worrying, but it's not the same thing, because you have a situation where, unlike 1933, where, you know, basically the people voted, okay, they didn't vote necessarily for precisely what they got, but basically, you know, the fascists came to power because the people were more or less behind them. Here you have a situation where in Britain and in Europe, the non-Jews stand to be murdered alongside the Jews. And that's a very different situation. I fear the Jews are going to get it in the neck, but basically it's not an analogy. I think it's a much cloudier situation. And so I do have sympathy with those Jews who say, well, this is all sort of hysterical, and, you know, because it's not like that yet. Having said that, I mean, I have family still there, and I am concerned. And we talk about it. We talk about it quite a lot. But it is a more ambiguous situation, and the fact that with the benefit of hindsight, we can all see that the decisions made by the Jews of Europe, the Jews of Germany in the 1930s, with hindsight, we can all see it was catastrophic. With hindsight, we can say, how could they possibly have thought that? But clearly they did think that, and therefore it follows that because Jews today are thinking also it's not time to leave, they must be wrong. I don't think one can draw that analogy. But I'm open to, you know, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I'm open to argument.
One last question.
When you lock horns with the intelligentsia, what's your approach? And what's your advice to others of us who might try the same?
Don't. The trouble with the intelligentsia is that they won't lock horns with me. They go to great lengths to avoid having any kind of argument or discussion with me, or I say me, people like us, they avoid the issue. They prefer to demonise and to try and shut down the argument, because what they don't want is to have the argument themselves. They run. So my problem is, let me at them. They don't give me the platform. That's my problem, because they don't want to engage at all, and there are many reasons for that, but that is the fact. And so, I've had, sort of an argument by proxy with them for for a long time, for several decades. And it's an argument by proxy in that it's done, I write something and then they write something, and they often don't refer to me by name, but I know that they are actually arguing with me, and so we have that sort of very strange argument. And all I can tell you is that the arguments that I put forward are never answered. They put forward basically a load of just insults. So that's the problem. You can't actually have the argument with them. And all I would say in conclusion is that what took me quite a long time to realise was that behind these arguments that were taking place, like for example on a television show, for example, I fairly regularly appear on the equivalent of your Q&A, which in Britain is called Question Time, and it's an absolute bear pit. It's an absolute bear pit. The audience is usually stacked, it becomes a shouting match, and it's very distressing to do. And it's very easy to lose sight of something or not realise something that I came to realise. That the studio audience is very threatening, and my fellow panellists are very threatening, because they were all basically against me, because that's how the BBC works. And the audience was basically against me, because the people who were shouting were all against me. Okay, so it's a bear pit, and it's awful, and it's horrible. And it took me a long time to realise that didn't matter. That was almost completely irrelevant. I was on television. And what I had to do was not look at them. I had to basically look at the camera. Because out there was the real audience. Out there were ordinary people sitting, watching this, and forming their own intelligent conclusion. They could hear what was happening, they could hear the arguments being put forward, the shouting down, or whatever it was, or not necessarily shouting down, people avoiding the question. And people are very good at hearing people avoiding the question, and so they were forming a conclusion. And I realised that out there was an enormous amount of support, which is very encouraging. But more important, they were listening to the argument. And so it was very important that I did not get sucked into this, how can I deal with this terrible noise? And this? I had to somehow find a way of making my points and almost completely ignoring the shouting and the screaming, just making the points so that beyond the intelligentsia, the people who really are intelligent were actually listening. And the final thing I would say is that it was quite the intelligentsia. This thing that we're all so concerned about, this madness, is confined to the intelligentsia. I find enormous relief when I'm faced with an audience or in some way talking to people who are the wreckage of Britain. They are unemployed, they have no education, they can't string a sentence together, and they are entirely sensible people who understand the difference between right and wrong. And when it comes to the Middle East, they know nothing about the Middle East, nothing. But if they do know anything, they think, Israel, yeah, that's like the Jewish country, and there are these Jews that's kind of like us, and they're surrounded by raving lunatics. That's all they know. That's good enough for me. So that's them. And then, as you go up the social and educational ladder, as as you find people who have a university education and who have very good jobs, then you find the madness, then you find the repudiation of reason, then you find the bigotry and the hatred and the malevolence, and they're really horrible people. And it's completely correlated with education and class. So, you know, the intelligentsia are the problem. One has to somehow find a way of speaking over their heads to the people who really matter, who are the really intelligent people, who have nothing to do with the intelligentsia.